What is a long war? What is Russia surprised to find after it surprised the world with the attack?
Well, wars begin by somebody rolling the dice. Stars decided to have this war, and they want to win it fast. Nobody starts a war thinking it'll go on for 22 years. In this particular case, the Russians rolled the dice, and it came up snake eyes. They wound up in a war they didn't want, which means that they have most of their force in already, and the Ukrainians are constantly building up their force, because whatever you take into surprise and survive, you have a lot more to put in there. So we're looking at a war which, if it doesn't get negotiated to an end, can take a very long time and really drain the Russians.
This is a profile using the word long, relatively speaking. The U.S. in Afghanistan was 20 years. In Iraq, I don't remember the exact count. I guess we can date it 2011, so 7 years. And both those fit the long war profile. The U.S. overwhelmed Afghanistan. I remember Donald Rumsfeld remarking that we're running out of targets. I think that was early on. We're running out of targets to bomb. There wasn't that much in Afghanistan to reduce to rubble. The Russians have continued to pound cities. Is that out of frustration? Is that because they don't know how to fight an insurgency or another peer? You could hardly call Ukraine's army peer quality. What is it that the Russians are demonstrating that makes this difficult for them?
Well, they have not been able to break the Ukrainian army precisely because it has no center of gravity. There's no point you hit and take them out. And therefore, they've been mobile, and they knew the countryside, and they were driving the Russians crazy. One option in this situation, if you don't plan to just back out, is, frankly, terror. You start inflicting massive casualties on non-combatants, combatants, with the hope that you'll break the spirit of the resistance, and that will work. They're experimenting with that. They haven't really cut loose on it, but they have started to do that, particularly, in their bombing of cities and of particular facilities. So it's not a pleasant thing to be doing, but when you're up against the wall, you sometimes try it to see if it works.
Now they're trying terror, mass bombardment of major cities. But you report they're running out of infantry. Did we know that beforehand, that Russia had a limit on its conscripts for any particular time?
Polish intelligence knew that. I'm not sure the U.S. intelligence did. Very early on in the war, I was told by people in Poland that the Russians had committed 80% of their force. I found that very difficult to believe because it wasn't that much of a force. I thought that they would have a much larger reserve ready to go, but in fact, they didn't, partly because they'd restructured their military and partly because they committed a massive sin. They underestimated their enemy. They thought that the mere presence of Russian forces would cause such a crisis of confidence, break their morale, that they'd capitulate very quickly. They did not expect them to stand and fight this way. And the force they had available was built around the assumption of shock and awe. They did not expect to have to bring in reinforcements.
What we're told now, in its fog of diplomacy, is that Russia says, through intermediaries, that it's going to concentrate on the Donbass, Luhansk, Donetsk, perhaps Mariupol as well, down to the Crimea, to develop what would be a corridor, a land corridor from Russia to Crimea. You report that would create more problems because it's what you call a narrow salient. Is there evidence that the Russians are thinking through how vulnerable that land corridor will be in the event that there's a apparent ceasefire but a long-term insurgency launched against Russia?
I'm sure they're aware of it. They're good commanders. And I also doubt that they're actually going to offer this. Remember that suggestion was floated by by connected sources. They have not yet put on the table for certain what their position is. The meetings that go on are all exploratory. So I don't think that they'd want that, particularly because they would have fought a long war. It would look good, but at a certain point, the Ukrainians come in and slash that wide open. So it's very hard to see how the war ends. And in the meantime, they're reaching a point that they've got to end it because their casualties are mounting so much.
Casualties and logistics resources. Another thing, did we know the Russians had trouble with logistics? Did we know that they couldn't deliver food? We're told that some of these conscripts appear at doors of civilians begging for food. Did we know that?
We didn't know it was that bad. We knew from back in the Cold War that the Russians had a tremendous problem supplying fuel to tanks moving forward. Now, one of the reasons that they never launched an invasion leaving everything else aside, is they really had trouble maintaining logistics line. It's pretty difficult. You've got 1,000 tanks moving forward and you got to fuel them. So we knew they had this problem. The problem they developed with food was simply their expectation of a short war. They didn't think they would be needing to supply them. And it was very strange how they began the war with 3 armored groups widely separated. None of them going to be having full logistical support, none covering the others. It was a war of confidence. They went in there thinking they're going to come in with 3 armored groups and that'd be it. And this is the Russian problem. They weren't prepared for the long war.
Is the Russian army being demoted from near peer to something equivalent to, say, less than Saddam Hussein's in 1992? Has that happened already?
Yes, very much so. In fact, Russia has been. Russia has a gross domestic product just below that of South Korea. It is not a rich country to decide. Now it's showing that its military force is incapable of sophisticated operations. So what's happening here is that the status of Russia is declining. And you see China slowly backing away. It also miscalculated what Russia was. And Putin is going to have to do something. And the reason I'm not convinced the war is over yet, because he badly needs a victory. He can't just leave now. He has to show somewhere, somehow, that he's achieved something. The bombings may be part of that, but I think he's going to throw one more shot and see what he can get.
You recall, George, in our youth, there was the witticism, and I believe some in Congress expressed it, that in the Vietnam Long War, we declare victory and go home. Is Putin capable of that kind of cynicism?
I don't think so, because, well, we weren't able to do it either. But if we went home, everybody would look at us behind our 2 oceans and say, okay, fair enough, they went home. Russia goes home. He goes home to Russia. There's a road, M3. It is a highway that goes to Moscow from Ukraine. And from the border to Moscow is 260 miles. They are sitting right next to them. This is their neighbors. They started a war with their neighbors. The neighbors are cocky, I think, about what they can do. And they're very worried about, the future. This is the worst outcome they could have.
We're going to turn now to other considerations. What can we say about the New World Order following this crisis in Europe? The energy is part of the story, the sanctions, the banking, NATO reawakened if it is. The negotiations are going forward in some fashion about the Iran deal of 2015 and the U.S. making an accommodation with the Iranian regime that is allied or linked to Moscow and to Beijing. When the hot war in Ukraine, what will it look like? NATO, Western Europe, the energy resources from Russia that are not now credible to be counted on, trustworthy. And also, we will include the negotiation between the U.S. through surrogates and its partners to the JCPOA of 2015. Is there a link in some fashion between how the United States is conducting the negotiations with Tehran? It seems the U.S. is accommodating everything Tehran is asking for, including money and including taking the IRGC off the terror list, if that report is accurate. And how the U.S. is conducting its relationship with Ukraine. They both seem at an arm's distance. Is that significant, George?
I think it's very significant. We'll talk about Iran in a bit, but the United States has realized that it has a unique and overwhelming power with the dollar, that all trade in the world is conducted in dollars, most trade. And if the United States stops cashing in your rubles for dollars, you're going to be in big trouble. And this is not a trivial capability, and it's superior in many ways to kinetic warfare. But the United States heralded the showdown with Russia with one with Iran. Remember, Iran has been under these sanctions for quite a while. And what's really going on is for the United States is adopted something new, and we're not quite sure is going to work.
The puzzle then about Iran. These negotiations are part of the way Moscow looks at the world. Moscow is participating in some fashion as an ally or an advisor or a backstop in Iran. At one point, there was said to be a deal, and then new claims by, I think it was Sergei Lavrov or someone else in the Kremlin, that they wanted to conduct business with Iran post-JCPOA. So are these negotiations now mixed up? About Ukraine, about Tehran, is it all one stew, George?
They are to some extent, but the Russians just are not that important at this. The really important powers had a summit meeting in Israel this week. This was the United Arab Emirates, where I'm at now. It was Egypt, it was Morocco. And all these countries gathered together in opposition to the deal with Iran. Remember that Trump dumped the deal with Iran because it didn't include missiles and didn't have really strong enough inspections. And the missiles were important because the Iranians tossed those around a lot. Now, Biden came in and essentially decided that if Trump had done it, it must be bad, and decided that he was going to renegotiate the entire thing. The problem is that every ally we have in the Middle East, Arab or Israeli, is utterly opposed to tightening on the Trump agreement. Finally, we see that a series of assassinations have been carried out by the Islamic State in Israel at about the same time these meetings were taking place. Now, the Iranians are behind the Islamic State. Now, given that one is Shiite and the other is Sunni, I find this very hard to believe. But he was very knowledgeable and very persuasive, and he said, look at the timing. Look what happened. We were there, and that's where they started the shooting. So what we're facing here is not only the question of Iran, we're now facing a potential intifada in Israel that would involve all of the Sunni world as well.
Central Asia, George. We must flag Central Asia as part of the future if all of these matters come to a successful conclusion. An essay at Geopolitical Futures points out to how much the economies and the workforces of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and the South Caucasus as well depend upon Russian trade or long-standing Russian relationships. That's not surprising. They were part of the Soviet Empire. So right now, your measure of Central Asia, watching this conflict in Ukraine, does it think of itself as in the target zone, we're next, and the same for the South Caucasus, Georgia? Or does it think of itself as having an opportunity here to reach a new accommodation with Moscow, weakened by this conflict?
Moscow visited them before this war in Kazakhstan, where there was some rioting, and the Russians came in as peacekeepers and arrested some of the major leaders, put them in prison, and basically has tried to take control of Kazakhstan, the largest country in the region. We see resentment from that, but it hasn't broken out. But we see Armenia, who's a pro-Russian and thinks it got screwed in the deal, beginning to send missiles and so on to various places. So one of the things that's going to happen here as the war ends is that a lot of countries that felt they had to work with the Russians are planning very hostile actions. The British just toured the South Caucasus, basically opening doors that were shut for them for a long time. So they're dependent on Russia, but they're in play, and it'll be interesting watching it.
China has an opportunity to grow its business into Central Asia, into the South Caucasus. Is that a possible consequence of China being disappointed with Russia and no longer being concerned with its competition with Russia?
They've tried that in the area and were unsuccessful because they tend to bring in their own workers to work on the various projects that they have. So when they do Belt and Road in Pakistan or in Uzbekistan, they bring their own workers. And there's a lot of resentment to China, and China is dialed back because of that. Many of these projects are work projects for Chinese, and the people who live there get nothing from it. So they have to rethink everything too, and then they're in the middle of a financial crisis of monumental proportions. They've got their own problems.
A year from now, the spring of 23, will we still see an active conflict zone in Ukraine, in the Donbass, or will that be a quiet border?
That will be decided in Moscow. In a sense, if Moscow and the Russian public decide that enough is enough, we'll be quiet. But if the Russians continue to operate there, to intrude there is going to be an ongoing guerrilla war of the sort that we see now, where out of nowhere, Ukrainian troops pop up and hit them. The Ukrainians are not going to give in. The Russians may not be able to give in for political reasons, or they may be forced to give in, but it's really going to be decided in Moscow.